My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of Arab Center Washington. I'd like to welcome those of you who just joined us for lunch today. Welcome. And I would like to just introduce this luncheon session in the form of a conversation, this time for the sake of diversifying. And I hope that you will enjoy that. Since we've been focusing on freedom, the word has been repeated so many times this morning, freedom of the press, freedom for the media, and so on. I just wanted to assure you, as you're enjoying your lunch, that your piece of chicken is free-range chicken. Thank you. At least one person appreciated it. The rest of you are dead. All right, there you go. Thank you very much. The conversation, I'm going to be actually introducing a friend who will be conducting the conversation with our special guest today. As I mentioned earlier this morning, the theme is going to be mostly focused on the case of Jamal Khashoggi, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and its impact on media and so on in terms of the investigation and what have you. The speaker will be, guest speaker would be introduced in just a minute or two. But I would like to take this opportunity to remind you, I know some of you were there, but back in 2017, Jamal Khashoggi, who's a good personal friend for more than 28 years, was our guest and spoke from this podium for Arab Center, Washington. And for those of you who are still puzzled by his case and would like maybe to understand why he met that unfortunate fate, I would like to invite you, if you don't mind, not now, when you have the time to do that on your own, to go back to our website, Arab Center DC, and take a look at that interview, the video of his presentation. I have a strong feeling that what he said, and whatever his words were very moderate, very mainstream, but whatever he said in that interview, I believe personally contributed to his vicious killing. So for those who are interested in that, if you go back to our website, take a look at events on Arab Center Washington during 2017, and you will see a video of that. At this time, I would like to introduce Reema Abuhamdieh. First and foremost, Reema is a very good friend of mine. We have known each other for years. As you know, I've worked with the media and during all different kinds of incarnations since we started the center, and long before that, with 30 plus years of activism here in Washington. And Reema, since actually her coming to Washington, we've been working together mostly as interviewer-interviewee. I mean, she gives me a hard time. But the good thing about her is she tells you in advance, are you ready for a tough one this time? So, and I love those because she really challenges you, and she really gives excellent interviews. Right now, she is a presenter and reporter for Al Arabi TV. And before that, she spent 10 years working for RT, 3 of them, 3 years in Moscow and 7 years here in Washington, doing excellent programming about the United States and particularly about U.S. Role in the Middle East. With that introduction, please welcome Reema Abuhamdieh.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khalil. That's a very kind introduction. And thank you all for being here and for being part of this important discussion today. We all know that the state of media in the Arab world is, to say the least, very difficult. And the murder of Khashoggi is just one example of what the ultimate price is for your word in the Arab world. To talk more about this from the expert who actually worked on the report of the UN investigating the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, we're happy to have Mr. I worked on this for a long time. Avezdjanov, the legal advisor to Agnes Callamard, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Summary or Arbitrary Executions, advisor to the UN Human Rights Inquiry into the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and program officer of Global Freedom of Expression at Columbia University. Thank you very much for being here. And I want to start with the report, with the UN report that you worked on, and in which it basically says that Mr. Khashoggi's killing constituted, and I am quoting here, an extrajudicial killing of which the state of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is responsible. Over a year had passed, a non-binding report. What are the implications?
So let's start from the beginning. The UN rapporteur, Agnes Callamard, decided to investigate this killing, and in a way in response to the fact that the international community was not willing to do anything. Because he was killed in October, by January, December, you could see that there were discussions about how to proceed, and nobody was willing to, either legislatively, no country was willing to do anything, at the UN, nobody was doing anything. So she thought that this is part of her mandate as an independent expert, and that she needed to kind of pick up the ball and just kick it forward. And she did that with this report. You're correct in the fact by pointing out it is a non-binding report, because rapporteurs are independent experts, and they don't speak for the UN, they speak to the UN, or at the UN. But sorry, some malfunction. But the importance of the report, like you said, it did several things. First, again, it kicked the ball forward, which was very, very important. So it brought attention back to the killing. Two, let me do this.
Yes.
Okay. Two? No? Two? Yeah.
No.
Two, I think what's important is that at the time, there were a lot of leaks. There was a lot of information around about what happened, what exactly the Saudis did or didn't do. And there were a lot of denials, and this was a very political case. And what the UN rapporteur did by producing her report, which took 6 months to write, we conducted over 100 interviews, visited dozens of countries. And what it did, it gave a grounding, an evidence-based grounding to the fact that this, like you said, this was a state-sponsored killing, which was deliberate and premeditated. And I think it's very important because it told the UN, it told the international community, now you cannot really hide behind whatever you're trying to hide behind. Now you have all the information you need to move and do something.
But what happens next? I mean, the report is out since June, but again, it's a non-binding report.
Yeah. Well, what happens next is, and things, by the way, things are already happening. We can't say just the report was released and there's no action at all. We're in DC. Let's start from what happened here. We know, for example, that Senator Tim Kaine and Senator Leahy, Tim Kaine is from Virginia and Leahy is Vermont. Both of them used the language of the report and talked about it at the Senate. Senator Leahy contacted the FBI director using the language of the report, calling for the FBI director to declassify information related to the Khashoggi murder. Senator Tim Kaine, we met with him several times. He has similarly requested the FBI director to release information, and also he's trying to get the director of national intelligence to do the same. So we are seeing action, yeah.
And I'm going to ask you about the U.S. response versus the international response to the killing. But one more question about the report itself. Now Callamard, just a few days ago, is basically disappointed with the UN and with the response of Secretary General Antonio Guterres. And she basically says she was hoping that she would see Antonio Guterres say, let's at least see what can be done, how far more we can push our understanding of the chain of command. That is a very disappointing statement from someone who worked on the report, who was hoping that this report will kick the ball forward.
Yeah. So yes, of course, we expected more from the United Nations and from the Secretary General. Well, expected more in the sense, we know that he, unfortunately, has so far shown a lack of courage to take on and do something extra on Khashoggi killing. But so in a way, the response is not unexpected. We did expect at least some discussion about whether or not he should or shouldn't do anything. At the same time, at least what the UN Secretary General has done, and I'm not justifying his actions, he claimed that for him to initiate a criminal investigation into the chain of command, or to fully conduct a criminal investigation, a UN criminal investigation, that he needs at least a member state to request it. And so far, no member state has done it.
So what were the challenges now that no one has requested a criminal investigation into the killing of Jamal Khashoggi? That human rights violation report met or was faced with many challenges. What were the challenges?
Well, the challenges in terms of producing the report was, I think the biggest challenge was a resource challenge. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with special procedures, but UN special rapporteurs are all volunteers. So they do not get paid for the work they do. The UN gives a little bit of money to conduct a couple of missions. Like I said, we visited over a dozen countries, interviewed over 100 people. Myself and another senior legal advisor, Caroline Horn, who's not here, and Agnes Kalamart, both of us, we were pretty much paying for this out of pocket until we got some support from CPJ and from IMS and from Article 19, but that happened much later. So the first is resource challenge. Second, and I think challenge is that there was a lot of evidence available, but in the beginning, one of the biggest things we grappled with was the role of intelligence and the role of evidence produced by the Turkish intelligence and how to use it in our report. We didn't really need it because there was so much out there proving that there was a human rights violation. But it was difficult in a way to get certain states to talk to you and to disclose information to make it public. For example, we just something as basic as when we did listen to the tapes, like we're not allowed to take notes. Just these simple things which are very, very important if you're conducting a thorough investigation. At the end, I think the report isn't lacking in terms of evidence, but there were these difficulties that we're faced with.
You touched briefly on the response in the US when you talked about the Senate. However, many were disappointed with the way this current administration handled the whole killing of Jamal Khashoggi, siding basically with the narrative given by the government of Saudi Arabia over the narrative given by its own CIA and intelligence community experts. The international response, however, has been different. What is the significance of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in terms of this, in terms of the response that was both from the Saudi Arabia, or from Saudi, from the international community, and from the US, and what it showed as, some people at the end of the day prefer interests over human rights?
Yeah, so I think, and this has been mentioned before, I think the killing of Khashoggi is emblematic of the threats that journalists are facing everywhere. This is not the first killing of a journalist. Regrettably, it probably will not be the last. I think when we go to the responses, of course, it's unfortunate that the U.S. administration is not doing anything, but to be a little bit of a cynic, in the past, even if they did speak out loud against it, it's not as if things were actually being implemented. A journalist is killed, there are statements made, and nothing really happens afterwards.
But this goes even a step further. It's as if okaying or just turning a blind eye to what happened.
Yeah, no, it's an extremely dangerous narrative, and public officials, they do have a duty to make sure that their statements do not justify or incite murders of anyone, especially of journalists who represent freedom of the press. So of course, what this administration has done, and in our study, in our report, we actually identify that the first time in public, the theory of rogue agents was introduced by Donald Trump. It was introduced by Donald Trump after his call with MBS, but nonetheless, he was the first person to publicly claim that this possibly was a rogue killing. And that was very, very dangerous. Despite So it was very dangerous. But again, despite what he's saying, we could see that the U.S. Congress is acting. So, we cannot think of the state as a monolith. There are different actors within it. And we saw that the intelligence community was not happy what Trump was doing, and I'm pretty sure a lot of the leaks came out because of that, because of the fact they saw that, well, our administration is not willing to be forward about this. We're going to do it through the back doors.
So what's next? What should we expect from the U.S.? What should we expect from the international community? Given that it's, again, been over a year, we do have a report.
Yeah.
We do have the evidence, as you see, or as you say, but nothing actual. Should we expect justice to be served?
I think, yeah, I don't think we should look at this through kind of a negative lens. I'm not saying things are great, but at the same time, again, let me go back to the American legislative response. The U.S. House passed there's a Malinowski amendment to the National Defense Appropriation Act, which calls on the declassification of quite a lot of information related to the murder. It calls on the U.S. government to investigate it. It calls on sanctions to people who were possibly involved in the killing. It passed the House pretty much by a record vote of 415, I think, to 7. Right now, there is going to be a conference between the Senate and the House, and we do foresee this amendment being passed. And considering the way the Senate has acted on the killing, we saw Senator Menendez, we saw Senator Graham try to pass various bills that came out of various committees criticizing the administration's response and calling for an investigation. We foresee that the amendment will pass, and if Trump vetoes it, that it will probably survive the veto. So, granted, this will not happen now. This could happen in the future, but we do see at least additional resources from this country being invested. And I do feel that considering that Saudi Arabia is an American ally, if the United States does act, it will create a ripple effect throughout the world for the EU to start acting, for the Germans to start acting, for the French to start acting. And in a way, it is important for the US to show some leadership because Saudi Arabia is a very powerful state. I don't think we can expect Canada to take them on. I don't think we can expect Turkey to take them on. There needs to be a joint response because when Canada did try to take them on, in a very simple tweet criticizing the arrest of women's journalists, what happened? The Canadian ambassador to Saudi Arabia was expelled. Not a single country said anything. So there is a need for a joint response, and I personally believe that it will come.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the inaction on the part of the international community after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, except for some statements here and there, send out the wrong signal to dissidents and journalists and human rights activists around the world. Can you characterize what the impact is? What kind of signal are they getting? Should people be afraid?
If I was a journalist, I would be afraid. I think the signal is, of course, so there are two signals being said. I don't think it's a signal that a death doesn't matter, because again, we're dealing with a very powerful state. I think it's more of a signal. Some deaths matter and some don't, unfortunately. If I was a journalist, I would still be hopeful in the fact that, look at the response. Look at, all of you are talking about it. Look at the fact that the murder happened over a year ago, and every week there are news stories about it. There are documentaries being produced about this killing. There are movies, Hollywood movies being produced about this killing. There are books written about it. I know that Khashoggi will receive the Magnitsky Prize in a couple of days. And we know that Saudi Arabia has lost the public relations campaign. We don't see them in the public eye as much anymore. And so to me, the hope is, yes, maybe criminal accountability will not come, but that takes a long time anyway. But there is hope in the sense that the truth will come out. And truth in it by itself is a form of accountability, sort of narrative accountability, if you could call it that way. Yeah.
So with that hope, what do you think is the state of media is now in the Arab world? How hopeful it is? Is there, and as Jamal Khashoggi himself says, that a state-run narrative dominate the psyche. right
Yeah.
now?
Well, listening to the first two sessions, again and again, it was mentioned that we had, the Algerian president was ousted after 20 years in power. We had a genocidal dictator ousted in Sudan. We have these mass protests in Lebanon. And we had, surprisingly, protests in Egypt, in a country where any criticism of a journalist will be faced, or any criticism of the government will be faced by arrest, detention, torture, and oftentimes, unfortunately, death. But so we can see that the yearning for freedom and the yearning for speech and expression is there, and that is impossible to defeat. Yes, in the Middle East, it's oftentimes faced with police, with militias, with soldiers, with batons, imprisonment, again, all the most horrible things, but it's not going away. So I think the situation is complicated. On the one hand, you do have this innate willingness to speak, and it seems that it's very difficult to just shut up the people. On the other hand, the response is very, very brutal. But no matter how brutal it is, the voices are not disappearing. And to me, this is what gives me hope.
So how can you, not as an individual, but how can you and how can the international community support freedom of expression in the Arab world? And I know in the report you laid out some steps to support freedom of expression in the Gulf countries, but the whole Arab world basically needs that. What kind of mechanisms can be introduced into the Arab world to support freedom of expression, but support media in general?
Yeah. So the rapporteur right now, I'll let you know what we're doing. First of all, we're still continuing the investigation just because there's quite a lot of information in terms of the cleanup and whatnot. But in terms of mechanisms that would affect everybody else, there are two mechanisms. One is she proposed to create a standing mechanism to investigate threats against human rights defenders and journalists. And we secured some funding, and we're actually going to run with some pilot investigations in this coming year. So this is going to happen. And the mechanism, it will involve other special rapporteurs, such as Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression. There's a lot of them. There's several dozen of them. But the idea is that these independent experts will be able to come in and step in when the killing of a human rights defender or journalist occurs, and they will be able to extract the needed information to, again, kick the ball forward. That's one. Two is the Special Rapporteur is also developing a protocol on threat prevention, which will be a very important tool because, one, it will standardize and create some kind of a normative framework about how states should respond to these issues. And it will also give tools to people around the world on how such investigations should occur. And three, there are quite a lot of academics here. And at Columbia University, one thing that we're launching, unfortunately, Jessica who used to work with SMEX is gone, we're launching a database in Arabic of freedom of expression case law. And the reason we're doing that is because we feel, people talk about speech, people know that they have the right to speech, but unfortunately, when it comes to normative issues, when it comes to comparative law, there's quite a huge knowledge gap. And that knowledge gap needs to be filled. And our way of doing it, because at Columbia we've been running a case law database in English and in Spanish for about 6 years, and it's been very successful in terms of helping litigants, in terms of helping advocates, activists, journalists, or even students to educate themselves on various issues related to free speech, about new trends, and about how to respond and think kind of in a forward-looking way. And we hope the same will happen with this Arabic language database, which unfortunately, as rich as the region is when it comes to culture, knowledge, comparative education is still lacking.
And this is very commendable. On the other hand, people in the Arab world say, if you want to kill an issue, create a committee. How can you pressure Arab governments, Arab regimes, to at least maybe not offer 100% freedom of expression in the Arab world, but at least some space, at least maybe not meet those journalists and dissidents with threats and killings and jail times and.
It's a very complicated question. I don't think if I have an answer for that, but I think what I can say from a person who mostly oftentimes works with Western governments is that I think Western governments have a responsibility to be more courageous and the response to these violations. I think a lot of Western governments, unfortunately, are quite fearful about what will happen in the Middle East once you give some freedom, because they think about what happened post-Arab Spring, and and when they look at Sisi, they're happier for example, for Sisi to rule the country with his bloody fist than to allow people to simply leave, and because there are worries that will create. I'm not saying the worries are justified, but there is this fear, but this is when our human rights values are challenged. They're not challenged when everything is comfortable and secure. They're challenged when you're willing to take a stand for your principles, and you're willing to say enough is enough, and knowing that it may well lead to something that could be difficult and unstable. But I think as it's an experiment, and we need to experiment.
We'll open up the floor for questions if anyone has questions. Until we get the questions, and I go over some of them, I wanted to ask you if there is any light at the end of the tunnel. Is there a tunnel to start with?
Yeah, I don't think there is necessarily a tunnel, but there is definitely a lot of light. Like, it really, I think all the tools and mechanisms are there. It really, it is the willingness of certain communities and certain governments, if we look at it from top down.
Okay, let me start with the first question. Has MBS suffered any consequences in Saudi Arabia, or has the kingdom supported his denials of liability, I guess?
Okay. I'm not well, when we did the kind of investigation, we didn't really focus much on individual criminal responsibilities and what is happening to MBS internally. From what we're seeing, it is true that, like I said, Saudi Arabia has lost the PR campaign. Yes, after the murder happened, MBS went to Osaka, and everybody was hugging him, and Trump literally hugged him, and people were waving and smiling. Yes, he went to Davos, and the president of Davos said, well, you had some problems in the past, but it's all gone now. So we have these responses. At the same time, we do know that he is not as public as he used to be. That they just had their Davos in the desert. That the coverage of Davos in the desert wasn't as large as it was initially. So they are suffering the public image issue. And I think the biggest thing is the report and other reporting on the Khashoggi murder has shown is that whatever he travels, and again, this way I said narrative accountability matters, people know what he's done, and that will not go away.
Question from Mr. Dawood Kuttab, a question on everyone's mind. Where is the body?
We don't know. We tried, but this is one of the things that, which is why we keep calling on the Saudi authorities to open up the trial, is because there are supposedly 11 people, and we know that there are 11 people in trial in Saudi Arabia. 10 of them were part of the kill team. Their argument, they keep saying that they gave the body to some local asset in Turkey who got rid of it. But there has to be something more. And the only reason for us to find out is if the trial is open to public scrutiny, if there's proper cross-examination, because the information is there, but we need to have access to it.
A question from Rami Khouri of AUB Beirut. Can a private citizen take any legal action that contributes to holding the Saudi killers of Khashoggi accountable?
Yes, actually. We do know that there are a couple of civil trials going on in the United States related to Khashoggi. We can't really share much information, but private citizens are taking some action. We do know that, I'm not sure how far they've gone with it, but there were some theories that by killing Khashoggi that the American right to the right to inform, because an American journalist was killed and our access to his expertise has disappeared, that our First Amendment rights had been violated. So there are various kind of legal issues in play that some are taking on. again, legal accountability, no matter the country, takes a very, very long time. Only a year seems like a very long time, and maybe you want more after it's just passed, but even if Khashoggi was killed, I feel like in the United States, it would still take years and years for the legal processes to conclude.
So these two questions about Turkey: what was the level of the Turkish participation in the investigation, and was there any feeling that Turkish officials were leading investigators to specific results, I suppose, and why the government of Turkey is not spearheading the effort to investigate KSA responsibility of the murder of Khashoggi?
No, let me start with the first question. I think we're very grateful to Turkey, what they've done. They were the only country which gave us access to the intelligence information that they've had. They allowed us to come and interview prosecutors, to interview various lawyers, various investigators who were working on the case. And I feel that without their cooperation, we wouldn't have known what has happened in the embassy. So we're very grateful for that. Yes, it's true that Turkey had probably their own political interests in allowing us to have access, this broad access, but nonetheless, they've done their duty, at least as far as this investigation is concerned, to some extent. And in terms, what was this? Oh, why they haven't done anything? Well, I think it's because Turkey is afraid. Turkey repeatedly has said that they're going to request the Secretary General to launch an investigation, but then Turkey is afraid of the Saudi response. And Saudi Arabia is a very powerful country, and I don't think Turkey should be expected to take on this very rich and wealthy country with so many powerful allies by itself. Again, I mentioned the story of Canada. Look what happened to Canada. A much closer allies to Western countries, and not a single one spoke up. Can you imagine what will happen to Turkey if they suddenly decide to, be more aggressive towards Saudi Arabia?
And I guess that answers some of the other Turkey questions, but I'll do a couple more. Why has Turkey, a member state, not called for action at the UN? I think you just answered that. But let me further ask about this. Many expected other countries to maybe call for investigation by the UN, especially some of the member states that voiced their concern and their strong opinions regarding the killing of Khashoggi. Even countries that do not necessarily have strong relations with Saudi Arabia. But we've seen nothing.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I think it's because, and this is my personal opinion, I think it's because this rhetoric of, well, let me go back. At the Human Rights Council, when we presented, Tunisia made a very interesting comment. Most of the countries who were there at the Human Rights Council complimented the report, and then Tunisia's government made a statement saying that we should be careful trying to destabilize Saudi Arabia for the safety of the country and for the security of the region. And I think that's a statement, or that's a belief that's shared by not just Tunisia, but across the Western world as well. And there's this fear that the instability in Saudi Arabia or any other country there will somehow lead to more terrorism, to more refugees. I'm not saying these fears are justified, but these fears are real. And because of this, I think these countries just don't know how to respond. And their choice is, well, let's simply remain silent.
Talk about the prosecution. Can International Criminal Court interfere? What are the Turkish authorities doing in this regard?
We're not sure if the ICC can interfere because neither Saudi Arabia or Turkey are signatories. You could think about the crime in terms of universal jurisdiction. Universal jurisdiction usually applies when it's a crime against humanity or something quite serious, and that's generally counted by the number of people killed. And here you just have one journalist. Our argument against that would be, well, if the crime is so grave, then universal jurisdiction applies, and that's when you could have other countries that could start intervening, maybe who are members of signatories to the ICC. But in terms of what Turkey is doing, they're not looking for an international response. They're actually arguing that these people should be tried in Saudi Arabia, and this is a domestic matter for them.
And they cannot try them, and
they
cannot charge or sentence somebody in absentia.
Yeah, so
as per the Turkish.
Yeah, so as part of the so just to clarify, what happened is that Turkey requested Saudi Arabia to extradite the suspects, to bring them back. Saudi Arabia is of course refusing. Turkey, at least as of 3 weeks ago, the Turkish prosecutor made a public statement saying that they will begin some sort of a criminal trial. They can do all of that. The problem is that under Turkish law, they supposedly cannot sentence anyone in absentia. So all that will create is, I think they have 18 suspects. So all it will create, you'll just, let's say, in a year, you'll have 18 convictions, but 18 convictions without a sentence. And that doesn't really do anything.
Do you think other Saudi journalists have been killed in Saudi Arabia that we don't know about? And do you think the international outrage has scaled these killings back?
I'm not sure. We don't know if there have been others killed. We do know that the arrests are still continuing. We do know that the system hasn't really changed after Khashoggi. I mean, and I think the best example is if we look at what's happening with the women's activists. I think a couple of them were released, but they're on house arrest, but the majority of them are still in prison. And whatever is happening, I think it's still continuing there with impunity.
Taking the uprisings in Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt in comparison to countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, how do you expect people to express themselves when the retaliations are expected to be much harsher and socio-political culture is so much more stifling?
How do I mean, they are expressing themselves. Again, like I said, in Sudan, I think when people started protesting, they knew what was going to happen to them. When Iraqis went on the streets, hundreds were killed, but they're still on the streets. The same thing with Algeria. We do know that journalists who helped incite the protests are still facing backlash and prosecutions following the ousting of the president. But despite that, they're still speaking up. And I think all we can do as an international community is to tell their stories, to make sure that the world knows about them. But I think that these are very courageous people that, no matter the dictatorship, no matter the system or the country they're from, they're still willing to speak up. And I don't think that will disappear because of deaths and threats and fear.
How do we push journalism, media to be informative and educational for all of its citizens, especially as we live in this age?
I mean, it's also a very complicated question. I think it goes back to this notion of the marketplace of ideas. Everybody says that speech, at least in America, speech should be unregulated because the idea is that if you have bad speech and good speech, somehow it will equal each other out. Well, we know that's not the case because we know that actors at the marketplace, they have different powers. If you're a richer speaker, you will have more space to speak. If you're a speaker of a certain ethnicity, skin color, you'll have more prominence. And so the only thing that we can do is to make sure that this marketplace is regulated to such an extent that the ideas are shared properly and rightfully, and everybody has a voice to speak. I do also agree with the very first speaker, Mark, about this notion of two-sidism. I think we should stop with this idea that everything has to have, every idea has to have some kind of an opponent or something critiquing it. Some ideas are not very good, and maybe we should let them die out in silence.
Is pressure on regimes like Saudi Arabia possible without divesting from their funding and capital? How can we pressure the U.S. organizations and businesses to divest? And that, I think, speaks to what Trump kept saying throughout the investigation and afterwards, that we've got billions of dollars coming from.
Well, that's a Saudi strategy, right? Wherever, if you want, wherever you go to Saudi Arabia, they will offer you some kind of a contract. From what I understand, most of these contracts are not really honored. But that's the way politicians work. They work in, they are elected for 4 to 6 years in the West, and multi-billion contract that will not be honored is good enough for them because it creates, a good PR. In terms of divestment, I mean, I think again, it speaks to, do we care about our principles? Do we care about human rights? Are we willing to are companies willing to take a hit on their shares? Is Uber willing to say, Saudi Arabia, stop investing into our company, we're going to give it back, and then see, let's say, a 5-point drop on its stock? From what we're seeing, no, they're not. But they need this courage, because I think there are plenty of ideas, there are plenty of actions. We've been having a lot of times the same conversations for decades, but the courage is still, unfortunately, not there.
Let me just take this question on a bit further. When you say we, are you referring to citizens? Are you referring to activists? Are you referring to those companies who are not willing to divest? And if you're referring to those companies, what would it take for them to divest? What should people do?
Well, I'm referring to everyone. Well, yes, if you're a person in power, you're a we. If you're a company, you're a we. If you're just a private citizen, you're a we. First of all, at least in Western countries, hold your elected officials accountable. In the States, we see that, again, there's some action in Congress. That's a result of people voting for individuals with the hope that, they'll take the right action. And if they're not, call them. If maybe stop taking Uber. Like, there are things you can take. I'm not saying they're going to be effective, but, every person has a role to play, no matter how small. But in terms of divestment, again, but that's a very different issue, about capitalism and the way it works and the role of money and stocks. So I don't think we can necessarily, as citizens, can force a company to divest its funding. But again, what we can do is to ask them and to pressure the CEOs to stick to the human rights principles.
In the case of South Africa, that worked.
Yeah.
So maybe more divestment. Can you tell us more about the effect of Trump's rhetoric on the human rights generally, and for this case in specific?
Yeah. Well, on this case, I think it's not, well, his rhetoric was, of course, very harmful. I think for us, it's what the actions of his administration. For example, we didn't really have access to whatever CIA had. We met with the State Department a couple of times, but again, the interactions were somewhat limited. So it's more of, it's not what he spoke, it's of what he said or gave orders to for whoever was involved in this to not to speak to us. And that was harmful. At the end, again, we collected the evidence we needed, but it would have been very helpful if this information was released outright and if they were giving the green light to speak to us. But in general, public officials, and this was confirmed by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, I think in 2008, in a case concerning Venezuela, where you had officials there going on TV and saying that journalists from certain radio stations are producing fake news and they're destroying the country. And the court came out saying, well, as a public official, you have the duty to make sure that your actions and your statements don't incite threats and violence against journalists, especially at a time of social polarization. So this at least is a regional normative standard. And by Trump, by his aggressive rhetoric, he's violating these standards.
Among other standards.
Among other standards.
He's violating. How do we counter state cyber control?
Well,
give us an answer in like 2 minutes.
2 minutes? Well, the biggest, I think, and it's in their recommendations, is stop selling surveillance equipment to regimes like Saudi Arabia, or just in general, maybe stop selling surveillance equipment. I don't know if you have some time, do go on YouTube and just look up like a hacking company ad, and it's the scariest thing ever. They're advertising the fact that, oh, somebody's trying to undermine your company, and taking them to court is not enough. Well, hack them, and we're going to help you. I mean, this is quite scary, and this equipment is being sold easily to the highest bidder.
This is how they got to Khashoggi and through one of his.
Well, we don't know if they got. And again, Citizen Lab out of Canada, they did mention that one of the Saudi dissidents, Abdulaziz, who was in communication with Khashoggi, was his phone was hacked by Pegasus, product sold by NSO Group, and that it's very likely that if his phone was hacked and Khashoggi was communications with him, that Khashoggi's phone was then infected as well. But again, we don't know. So we could know because, again, this is something Turkey hopefully will do one day. After Turkey has Khashoggi's 2 phones and his laptop. And actually, the very first thing reading the documents that the Saudis requested from Turks wasn't evidence that they collected or the tapes. It was, give us the cell phones and the laptop. And if we have access or if this technology is given to a third party, then we'll know what exactly Saudis have been doing on his phone or if they have penetrated it.
Well, it's in court right now. There are so many cases against Pegasus.
Yeah.
And so let's hope that gets somewhere. There was a complaint filed at the ICC on July 18th, 2019, and it's under consideration.
Yeah.
Tell us more about that.
I think the complaint you're talking about, it's under consideration because, again, they're trying to establish whether or not there is jurisdiction over it. But the complaint didn't come from us. But again, the ICC at this point, from what we've seen, doesn't really have much of a role to play yet.
Because?
It's a jurisdictional issue.
Okay.
Yeah.
This question is, was there a deal made between Trump and BS with Erdogan so recordings won't be released to public? And as is mentioned in the report, let me just add to that question. The report does say that you could not have clones of the recordings, you could not take notes. Were you able to listen to them at least more than once?
No, we were not able to listen to them more than once, but so just so you know the way it was, we listened to about 45 minutes, and it took us about 5 hours to listen to them, and we had our own interpreter, just so, because Turks provided us with a transcript, which had, a little bit extra spice to it, but I don't think there was necessarily a deal. I think first of all, the information is not released, and I don't know if there are any intelligence experts here, because there is I think Turks had a worry that if they make their recordings public, that then some other country would be able to see what Turkey is using to bug consulates. So in a way, it makes sense why they didn't make them public. But again, speaking of the recordings were not that important. At least what they did, they helped us see what exactly happened in the period that Khashoggi was inside the consulate. But even without the recordings, we know that this was a premeditated state-sponsored killing because we had flight data showing that their diplomatic planes were being used. That that we had 15 people come in on some of them came in on diplomatic passports. We saw Khashoggi's double exit. We knew that they had a medical expert on the team. So the information besides the recording was enough. So I don't really think the recording played such a huge role. I think what they could play a role for prosecutors once they start trying to establish individual criminal responsibility. But even then, intelligence evidence is not really evidence in court, just because it's very difficult to understand what doesn't exist. What I mean is, we listen to 45 minutes, but there are hours of recording. We don't know what was before, what was after, what was in between. So oftentimes, this kind of evidence is usually supported by something else. And so, but the recordings by themselves, they're not key.
And the last question in the time remaining, is there a role for political satire, comedy in the Arab world? Is that an effective venue for dissident?
I think, from what we've seen, it's probably one of the most effective venues for dissent because it's entertaining. But two, I think it takes sometimes a bit of a time for a regime to catch up in the fact that they're actually being made fun of, and it's not just some caricatures on TV, because it's a language of you speak. It's kind of double speak. You speak between the lines. You hide criticism in the joke, and it's a very successful system here. It's a very successful system, at least in Egypt when it did exist there. And I still know that I think or still they have the
I mean,
centers.
you mentioned it, but they're not there anymore. I mean,
Well, they do it
have
out of London, yeah.
Yes, I mean,
But-
they do have it, but out
But
of.
they still reach the Egyptian population, so that's quite important.
So you do believe that?
I do believe in satire.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your insight and for all of your work on to bring to light the gruesome murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And I promise I'll do it right this time. Avezdjanov, living in Russia didn't help. Thank you very much for your work, and thank you for this discussion, and thank you everybody. And I was asked to remind everybody that the next session starts at 2 p.m. in the other room.